Welcome. I'm Carrie Verakier, Vice President of Global Impact and Employee Life at Workday and President of the Workday Foundation, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm so glad you're here. We're going to have a great discussion today, and I encourage you to put any questions that you have into the live discussion box at any point during our conversation, and I will integrate them into the discussion. First, I'd like to start out by introducing our esteemed panelists. Sid Espinosa, Director of Citizenship at Microsoft Corporation. Sarah Kay, Vice President for Inclusive Solutions at Prudential. Michael McAfee, President and CEO at PolicyLink. And Justin Steele, Director at Google. Welcome, everyone. So over the last 7 or so months, we have experienced twin pandemics. One that emerged at the beginning of the year and the other that has been with us for generations. And they're both really intertwined. They impact our work today and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And what happens in our country over the next 21 to 90 days will further impact our work going into 2021 and well beyond. That's what we want to explore, what that future may hold, and just really building on what's happening today. So we hope to have an interactive discussion as panelists. We are not going to jump from one panelist to the other, asking each person to answer every question. So I encourage my panelists to please chat amongst yourself if there's something that you want to chime in with. But to start things off, a really easy question. How has 2020 changed the world for you? And Sid, why don't you kick things off first?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for hosting this panel. I think it's an incredibly important conversation. And I think that we as leaders in this space really need to pause and take a moment to come together as a community and think about all that's happened, how our lives have changed in all these different ways, and what it means for the work that we do in community. My life has changed because I am in solitude alone all the time in this space. I think for each of us, we reflect now on how our lives have changed as individuals, families, communities, in the cities, the nation, and internationally. And I add to your both the COVID pandemic, the race and equity conversations that we're having as a nation, but also the election and sort of the failure in governance that we've seen and what that means for communities. So I think, all of our lives have changed given those contexts, mine included, both in the way that I'm living at home and the way that we are working at Microsoft. And I'm sure we'll talk about that and how that's changed.
Thank you. Anybody else? How's 2020 changed for you? Work, personal?
The sad thing is that it's accelerated our work. Unfortunately, this nation responds to crisis, rather than trying to find ways to deal with things in a healthy manner on the front end. And so the issues of equity, the issues of what's happening to low-income people, especially people of color, it's only been exacerbated because of this moment. And that means that our work becomes even more important. It's still tragic. Sid talks about the failure of governance when you think about it right now. Folks having to stand in line for 8 to 11 hours in America to vote. That's by design and intentionally, and that's really tragic. So the hardest thing for me personally is to watch the intentional harm that's being done and to really have to take it and to try to have to work within institutions and structures that aren't really designed for me to have the impact that I want to have in the short term. And so seeing folks have to go through that pain to participate in this democracy is really hurtful. It's hurtful personally, and it's hurtful for the nation. And that's probably the hardest thing for me to deal with in my role.
I would add, everything that Sid and Michael said. I think the world has changed and we don't know what the new normal is going to be like going forward. And I think that is across all different aspects, whether it's the work that we do, our personal lives, our social lives, and hopefully there are things that are going to change for the better, as Michael mentioned and Sid talked about, all of the inequities, the racial disparities, everything that we all have known and we've all been working on these issues for so long, I think have come to the forefront for the vast majority of people that may not have focused on these issues. So I hope that this is not just a moment in time, but this is something that's going to propel this country forward to help close some of these inequities. I think personally for myself, my parents live with me. They're immunocompromised. So I have been in pretty strict quarantine. So it has drastically changed the way that I live my life and what my work will be like until we know what the future holds with vaccines and, when that time will come. I think there are so many different aspects that have been changed. And I hope for the better, even though right now it's really hard and it's a really challenging and difficult time.
Yeah, I think we've all had to really exercise our agility muscle quite a lot in 2020. I think that we are getting new things are being tossed at all of us as professionals all the time that are outside of our daily practice, I would say. And it's been a roller coaster ride. I think that was long overdue, this call for action. And so one of the things that is the positive, just to sort of jump in on what Michael was saying in my mind, is this accelerated collective push for action feels very different right now. It feels real. It feels like we have got a lot of people that have a vested interest in creating lasting systemic change. And I haven't felt that collective power in the same way before. So I think that's the positive side that I've seen. And trust me, there are many negatives, but that is one thing that's definitely changed for me and my work. In the time since George Floyd was killed, over 20 million people have taken to the streets. How do you all think about the role of your company, your philanthropy, and your CSR efforts in relation to an upswelling of calls for change? Justin, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, and Carrie, you were just saying that this has been such an upswell of support. We had a similar moment in 2015 after the Charleston church shooting at Google. And I'd say that moment was largely led by the Black Googler Network. We sort of had banded together. It was very grassroots. I remember we did a giving campaign, a blackout week where we're trying to raise consciousness and put employee dollars behind movement organizations, and we raised about $100,000. And of course, we got a Google.org commitment, and we eventually put tens of millions of dollars towards racial justice work. But this moment's been different in that you really have a broad coalition, and we put a giving campaign out this time around. And we just shattered every internal record around employee giving and fundraising. We raised $12 million for racial justice organizations on top of the $12 million that we committed as a company. So we had 10,000 Googlers participate. So I think that's been really encouraging. I think institutionally trying to take this moment to figure out how we can push further than we did in the last moment. I think 5 years ago, we were just moving to a place where as you were doing your philanthropy, because before it felt like we were kind of trying to operate in a colorblind space. And so we had the permission to have a racial analysis. I think what Alicia was saying earlier on the panel, this moment really shifting to power and transforming systems, I think is a unique opportunity, and excited to be leaning into that.
Yeah, I mean, you've been funding in the racial justice space for a while. And so, Justin, just to stick with you for a little longer, and you talked about this sort of collective, intent to really change the systems and systems of power. Where do you see, Google and your work, you've really been a leader in this space for a long time. Are you seeing sort of the characters coming out from all over that weren't vocal before, and now you've got them as allies and partners by your side? And are you doing any co-funding, or how is that working for you?
Yeah, for sure. It's been incredible. I think back in 2015, our allies in this work were, Levi's and Ben and Jerry's. There was a couple other companies. really out front around racial justice. And it's been really encouraging to see, especially on the tech side, Intel and Cisco and all these other companies who have been standing up and making racial justice funding. I think, again, like trying to push to the frontier, though, what a lot of companies in this moment are starting to get comfortable with is that racial analysis. Like, I kind of talk about moving from representation to justice. So a lot of our philanthropy in the past has been, how do we get more Black and brown kids into computer science classes, or how do we get better representation in job training programs? And I think this moment is really about a movement, and we start talking about how do we move towards justice. So it's really about how do we build power in Black and brown communities? How do we start to transform the systems that are sort of the root of the problem, not just giving people a seat at the table, but actually transforming the table itself? And that, I think, fewer companies are jumping out. And I wouldn't even claim that Google's there yet. I think we're sort of pushing ourselves and challenging ourselves, but it is a very uncomfortable place to be, especially in the political climate that we're in, because when you start talking about building power and transforming systems, you start to trip up into sort of the polarization of the country and the politics of this issue. And it becomes much harder, especially for companies, right? Because as companies, we have lots of battles to fight in other arenas, and we're not necessarily looking to pick another fight. And so that's been a real interesting challenge in this moment, to think about, okay, we've moved towards better racial representation, but how do we push even more into justice? And that's really challenged us in this moment.
Yeah. Sid, Sarah, how have your companies responded as the call for companies to be more involved in all aspects of social justice? Those voices have gotten louder. How have your companies responded, and what do you see as the role of your respective companies as far as addressing social justice issues?
Sarah?
Okay, you want me to go first? This has been, part of it is recognizing the work that we have been doing for a number of years through our CSR and what we now call our Inclusive Solutions Department. And we oversee strategic philanthropy, our sponsorships, impact investments, and our diversity, inclusion, and culture work as well, too. So one is making sure our employees know the work that we have been doing. We've invested over $400 million during the time period around racial equity and justice issues. But I think at the same time, our company is 145 years old, and we have to recognize our place in structural racism and how we've created some of the systemic discriminatory practices that exist in financial services. And so part of the work that we've been doing is making sure all employees recognize our role in that, making sure that our employees understand where we are and how do we now become part of the solution, and so that we're not continuing to drive race-based underwriting, but we're actually making corrective actions and making reparations. And so I think there's an internal aspect of where we are, acknowledging where we are, and thinking about what are the solutions going forward, and how do we engage? How do we make sure that not only are we recruiting, retaining, and promoting people of color, but also what are we looking at in terms of our products and services? How do we make sure that it is applicable to people of color, that it's being marketing in a culturally appropriate way, and really thinking about the holistic business model of how we do that. And then at the same time, also continue to invest in the organizations that we're supporting around racial equity and justice issues.
Yeah, echoing everything that's been said. I mean, I think there's this reckoning happening across the country. Obviously, I think there's also a reckoning that needs to be happening within tech and within the tech community, and how both the growth of this industry and these companies, but also the technology itself and the impact that it's having in communities, and the ties then to race. We have been having those kinds of discussions. We also put real stakes in the ground right from the beginning. Our CEO paused, gathered leaders both within the community and externally, and really thought through some of those critical pillars of work that needed to take place, and to start, sort of with some, like I said, stakes in the ground, saying we will invest. And I think less than the numbers is the work, but 150 million in representation and culture, inclusion work that is doubling the number, a commitment around doubling the number of Black and African American people managers and senior leaders, et cetera, by 2025. We had a whole stream of work that he outlined related to leveraging our balance sheet and engagement with suppliers and partners. $100 million with FDIC for minority-owned depository MDIs for funds that would really focus on local communities. Another $50 million fund for small business, a doubling of the number of our Black and African American suppliers over the next 3 years, a $500 million commitment there, a commitment to double the percentage of Black-owned banks that we work with. So really thinking about sort of our systems of work. And then, as people have mentioned, sort of the community strengthening, we completely rethought an equity focus around our philanthropy, another $50 million around justice reform work that we've done. We've launched, we have a skilling focus as a primary area of focus for our community investment. We did a grant round that has just closed this week of focusing on nonprofit organizations that are run, that are led by African American or Black leaders, and just focusing on 50 of those coming together as a community over the coming years and really building sort of a workforce network in that space. I could go on, but we're really trying to think about every aspect of the work that we do. We're diving into the technology. We're really rethinking how we share power, how we build communities in different ways, and how we, in the philanthropy space, really do our philanthropy in a different way. But it's not, I think again, the good news is that there are people within the company that understand that this can't be an episode, that it can't be lip service, that it can't be, and that these are complex, difficult issues to work through. And we need to think about how we have honest conversations about where the company is, what it's contributing to in positive and negative ways, what our technology is contributing to in positive and negative ways, and continue to put that on the table and have the difficult conversations about change, about and empowerment. So, a good start, I would say, a good start to this work. It's good to have the commitment. It's good to have the understanding at the top. It's good to be engaging in different conversations with key partners and stakeholders, but still a lot of work to be done. And how we as leaders of this work within these companies sustain that, how we have it really lead to broader systemic changes in conversations, I think is the great challenge for us in the coming months.
Yeah, as someone that spent my entire career pretty much in CSR, I have to say, I never thought this moment would come where it would be widely accepted by CEOs everywhere that we are going to make stands on social justice issues because it's expected. I think it's awesome that we are expected as corporate citizens to acknowledge our role in some of the systemic issues that we face and to do something about it. And I think that is just an interesting moment in time. And Michael, you've heard the responses from the companies represented here on the panel and others, sort of what excites you or worries you when you hear these kinds of conversations?
Well, I'm holding both of those, excitement and worries. I think what Justin, Sarah, and Sid are signaling is a powerful awakening in corporate America. I think that is real. Justin used the word that is real. Justin used the word that is really important because it's the leading edge of the equity movement if you want to earn the right to expect a return on investment. And that word is justice. It's great to capitalize nonprofits, but that is not fully the work. There's more than 100 poverty in America. That's 1 in 3 people who are economically insecure. That's a design flaw, but it's a design flaw that was intentional. And so to move to justice, corporations have to continue to be working to be bigger than their statements. And that's the work for all of us in the nation, is to deal with the design challenge. And I'll give you some practical examples. We were talking with a major retailer recently, and they were shocked when we said, well, what could we do? And I said, imagine if you stopped contributing politically to folks who are making it difficult to participate in this democracy. Imagine the power of that. That would outweigh anything that you're doing on the CSR side. It would be transformative for electeds to know You've got to stop getting in the way of the most elegant expression of participating in democracy by just using your PAC dollars to set a standard. To just set a standard that says, no, we're going to stop investing in folks and institutions that are doing harm. That's what justice would look like. Those are the steps that we got to get to. But what I'm excited about is that I think corporations, I'm seeing corporations listen in a very different way than in the past. In many cases, we would have never been invited back after the first conversations that they've had with us, because we're pushing in a really hard way. Mm-hmm. But we're pushing in a way because I don't think corporations realize it or not yet, but they're actually at the leading edge of the equity movement outside of people power. They're at the leading edge of the equity movement because they've got a 22 trillion market cap to our 1 trillion in civil society. And they've got a unique skill set that is needed for this moment. They know how to bend the legal and regulatory framework of this nation to their will. We need them to continue to do that, but we also need them to do that for that 100 million that I'm talking about. They can do that more so than any of us in civil society. Our tax structure limits our ability to do that with the fervor that is needed, and government has been weakened. And so that's why I say that they're at the leading edge of the movement. I see them stepping into understanding that and beginning to think about those structural plays. And our job as a sector leader outside of the corporate space is to continue to support them, continue to think about what would be standards and guardrails that gives us some common way of understanding what the work of equity is, and to continue to push, to be a loving critic, the same way we need to be a loving critic of ourselves.
I'm totally stealing that phrase.
Maybe if I could just pick up on something that Michael was saying, and maybe a discussion, I'd be curious, my peers at other companies, how you all are dealing with this, but that idea of the leading edge, and where we've experienced that edge in our companies, I think, this moment has been interesting because all of a sudden public perception around Black Lives Matter shifted positive in the country, right? So, even just a couple of years ago, you didn't have the majority of the country affirming that Black Lives Matter was like legitimate and positive for the country. You do now. And I think a lot of our companies now then recognize that there's a brand equity opportunity for us to align ourselves. So, at Google, we were all of a sudden all these conversations like, we're going to put Black Lives Matter on our search page. We're going to put it in Google Maps. We're going to, produce a marketing video about search trends and highlight Black Lives Matter. And then the following question was, what responsibility then do we have to be in solidarity with the movement? And the next conversation after that is like, well, how do we feel about the movement for Black Lives? Because their platform says they're anti-capitalist, or they want to defund the police in addition to providing safety and opportunity for Black Americans. And how, as a company, how do we engage with that? And I know we pushed up to our edge, in discussing like financial support for Movement for Black Lives specifically. We eventually put $1 million behind the Movement for Black Lives, but it was hugely challenging and a lot of tough conversations internally about, like, how do we align ourselves with the movement, knowing that there's actually some parts of the movement where we can't stand in full solidarity as a company, at least yet. And, and so like, I'm curious where other folks are kind of finding those edges. Like, I think it's now safer for us to, get up and make proclamations and do the symbolic pieces and job training and education. But like, I'm curious where the edges are for folks.
Go ahead, Sid.
I can jump. I mean, I think that for us, I have a couple different lenses, and I'm just going to add to that another lens. A conversation I was having yesterday with our organizations we have GitHub and LinkedIn as also part of Microsoft, and as a group, all of the LGBTQ plus leaders within those communities were coming together to talk about how we could work better together as a company, because we've got these different folks, and we sort of went through each person's what the work really is, all the different aspects of it. And then we got to like this core point, which was like, everyone was done with pride, which was such an interesting conversation. But they're like, was anybody at World Pride in New York? Because the corporatization of a social movement was never better exemplified than every brand being about pride. And they're like, the company should still do it. There's still important work to do there, but we don't want our funds for the hard work that needs to be done to be about the marketization of a social movement to help the company. And so how do we separate that out, let the company keep doing that, but get to the real work that we need to do? And I think there's a parallel as we talk about this work. We too came in and sort of made large investments with some big partners, and I was having, with Black Lives Matter movement, I'm on the Tides Foundation board, the chair of the Tides Foundation, and there we have the Black Lives Matter movement just having come in as we're as the fiscal sponsor and fiduciary lead there. And so I've been diving deep with the work that needs to be done in that space with that movement and how corporate partnerships make sense or not for them. But as from a Microsoft side, as I was meeting with different leaders, as I was sitting down with NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I had to start with, I am sorry that we have not been at this table before together. Let's start right there. And the problem of why that wasn't the case. Now, let's also talk about not just this donation that we're making now, which has continued to grow. It's now it's millions of dollars now. Different parts of Microsoft are thinking about how they can engage Xbox and all these different ways that we can continue to contribute. But what's the real work we need to do together? What are the ways that all that we can offer as a company can come in and empower the work that needs to be done that you've been leading for a long time? And so there are a whole series of conversations that I think need to happen internally and externally, and how we keep the reality check on what we're really trying to get done and how quickly, we are massive companies, and we know how quickly it can just get usurped and taken in another direction. And suddenly it's become something that's not about the core. And I don't say that as a knock on the companies. These are great companies that are doing really good work, but I just think it's important for us to think about what it really means to stay with the core of where we are in this discourse. Sarah, sorry.
No, not at all. No, I think that's why, the departments of a CSR, or what we call ourselves inclusive solutions, is so important. And it's so important for us to be at the table, because when these conversations are happening, lots of times a marketing department will have this really great idea to attach itself to a movement or a brand and just run with it. And you're like, what are you doing? What are you actually focusing on? What's the ROI that you're trying to get to? And that's why, similarly to diversity conversations, it's so important to have a person of color at the table when you're making decisions on hiring, on laying off, on where you're going to move a business location. They all have cascading implications that people just don't tend to have. And I want to say the majority of people, it's not intentional, but it is this unconscious and implicit bias that ends up going through when they're making these type of decisions. And I think, we face that line all the time. We are a workplace solutions provider. So we have clients that range from large companies, but also to police unions, to teachers unions, to hospital associations. And so we always do walk this fine line. I think, part of where, all Sid, Justin, and I, and even PolicyLink, because I think we all partner with PolicyLink, is really understanding and helping the company leadership understand what is the right thing to do and why does the company need to take a stance on that, while also still responding to the needs of our clients and customers, but also helping to push our clients and customers about thinking about ways that they can make an improvements and reforms. And because we've gotten pushbacks when we are trying to either keep a client or recruit a new client, of why do you support X, Y, and Z? And we have to provide that reason. And we give, lots of page memos as to what the reason behind of it is. But I think it's really important for people like ourselves and others in the institution of pushing the institution in the right way, because if a certain few would just make the decision, I think you would see, some unfortunate practices or decisions being made without us at the table.
Yeah, Sarah raises an important point here. Solidarity is not about brand. It's about listening to that voice, wisdom, and experience of community. And the way we honor that energy that's been in the street right now and do right by it is to think about what would it mean to translate it into our organization in an authentic way. And I share that because in this very moment, the movement is about liberation. It's about liberation. And so if you're not about that, you're not in alignment with it, no matter whether you're a corporation or a nonprofit or whatever. And that means that it is a leadership moment for all of us. It's a leadership moment that means PolicyLink and corporate America and even government officials are going to have to risk some of our capital to be in solidarity with folks who are hurting the most in this nation. And if we're not willing to do that, we should think carefully about whether we should stay in these seats. Liberation is about reducing that harm. It is about freeing people from the oppressive ways in which structures in this country harm people. And leaders are getting that because they're saying it. And our job now is to help them really understand how to operationalize it. There's only so many structural plays to make here to create liberation. The first is freeing the will of the people so they're not held hostage by the political economy. They can't even participate in it fully yet. So one is around democracy. The other is to have an economy that is great for business, but also really uplifts that 100 million that you hear me describe. And there are a host of plays around that we can get to, and we can find some commonality. But I really wanted to signal that because there is no way to decouple this moment from the leadership task that it brings to all of us. And Sarah's point about clients is so real. I can't tell you how many conversations I've been in recently where folks were all excited to give us money in this moment. And then they go to our website and they'll see something like police abolition, and then they want to change their mind. My job isn't to sell people anymore and try to meet them. My job is to honor the street. That's my job. It's to honor the street. And that might mean that I might stay in this job for 2 years or 5 years. But that's the choice that I've made now. It's no longer about us holding this work hostage to whether people are going to get it. Because getting it assumes that folks are even trying to get it. That's a huge leap to make. Women shouldn't have to wait any longer for me to get it, to pay them fairly. LGBTQ community shouldn't have to wait any longer for me to get it, to come to work and be treated in a safe and equitable manner. And Black people shouldn't have to wait anymore for people to get it, for oppression to stop. Migrant workers shouldn't have to wait till I get it to be paid a fair wage. So it's a scary moment for all of us now, because the real question that's being called into play is how will we step into our power to lead from where we're at, not be martyrs, because we're not trying to flame out. We want to stay in this battle for the long haul. But it is about stepping into that dangerous space, as my colleagues are saying they're doing every day in their own way. All of us are doing that right now, and that's the work. And so I really wanted to center that what people are calling for is liberation. And this can't become another corporate-sponsored movement where everybody feels good and they've got their brand, but the design of the nation hasn't changed.
I wonder, Michael, if I could ask how you're thinking about the momentum, the sustainability, I come from a world of politics, and so often there's like an arc of campaigns. And I want to believe that this is not that. I want to believe that when the big earthquake, God forbid, hits soon, or whatever's coming next, and the world's attention shifts, or even if we should have a change in our presidency and people don't feel like there's something they're fighting in the same way, even, right? That they're like, okay, well, now we're good. Now we can go back to other, I have that worry because I've seen it again and again, where you're in something and you're like, this is it. This is a movement. Times are different. We're having a different kind of conversation. And then, we're on to what people see as like the next thing that they're on to. And I really, I've seen it too many times to, fool them, fool me. Like I know that there is a likelihood that happens. And so, I think both from the external and internal synergy that needs to happen to continue to move organizations and shift, sort of how do we build that into something that is sustained, something that the urgency remains, something that becomes, we keep saying systemic or cultural shifts, but that becomes our new.
Well, the first I would say is for all of us to think about really making a long-term institutional commitment to this work. If this democracy is going to be strong, it's going to take our institutions making sure that it's strong. This is nation building work. And the reality is the most effective way that I've found to do that is to center a population. That's why you keep hearing me talk about that 100 million, because it's my magnificent obsession. That is PolicyLink's population. The things that I want to do that aren't great won't get me there. I can't really see the numbers move on that population. It's a great forcing mechanism to say in 5 or 10 years, what do you want to have your contribution be to helping that 100 million population? And then the second thing that we've had to get clear about is, in some ways, rising above issue-specific things. Hold that interest of that population, hold the design of where we want to take the nation, and then we can be opportunistic when the right issue is in play. Because the reality is this, on the street, people are still talking about housing, jobs, fair pay, worker protections. Their issues haven't changed in probably 40 or 50 years. We just keep getting fancy, right, in terms of what we think is popular. And so what I would invite us all to consider is, what would it look like for us to say this has got to be a 20+ year journey? And it's got to be a 20+ year journey centered on a particular population. We got to call it. LGBTQ was a population. People called that population out and they stuck to benefiting them. This is really a key point, because I'll tell you, you see right now what happens when some groups honor their population. They tell you what they think of us. They tell you what they're going to do, and they're unapologetic about it. And the biggest critique that I have of my own sector is they've been unafraid to say my name for the last 20 years. And that has sanctioned the environment that we are in now. If you won't say our names, if you won't fight for the long haul, you can't be startled at what you're going to see. Because if you read books like Democracy in Chains, you'll see that what we are experiencing is not by chance. It's been a well-orchestrated intellectual frame that's been advanced politically. And we could do that same work if we were committed to it. If we were committed to a structural frame, if we were committed to structural work, and if we were committed to building institutions that could take on that structural fight that is going to have to be enduring. And the last thing I'll say here is, this is why I've been really excited about the leadership from corporations and philanthropy over the last several months. The way corporations and philanthropy have structured capital is freeing so many of us to get out of the issue-specific thing and do our primary task, which is to craft strategy that's worthy of the moment. And to me, that is a huge gift, that while corporations are still finding their footing, at least what I can say is they've given us a gift of freeing us a little bit so that we could be more aggressive in the fight while still staying in relationship with them.
That's awesome.
If I could just add one point to that, to your question, Sid, and everything that Michael has said, I think, even the work that Michael and his organization PolicyLink is doing with FSG and Just Capital on the racial equity CEO blueprint, right? That's now created a framework for where our companies should go. And now they're working on a 3-year project to actually, how do you execute and how do you implement and how do you keep people accountable? We also support B Lab, who's created the Be Global movement, and they're thinking about global multinational companies who can move towards certifying themselves as B Corps and their entire supply chain. And so I think these are the steps to hold companies accountable, to hold all institutions, and it's driven by the public. It's driven by public demand, and so hopefully we can see these shifts be sustained as a result of that.
Yeah, if I can just chime in for 1 second here, I feel like this is us. We're having a great conversation, preaching to the choir here. But Sarah, you just brought up something where you said, this is what we're demanding. And I think we need to be a little bit bigger now for the next part of this discussion as we think about the upcoming election, and the fact that we are not all aligned on this. We've seen that evidenced in the people that we've elected for office, and for those of us in corporations. I'm sure over the last 30 days alone, you have seen differing opinions bubble up on all sorts of internal chat boards. How are you guys handling that delicate balance? And Michael, I understand that you're saying, don't be timid, just go all in. But most of us have agreements with our employees that we will respect differing opinions, that We're an inclusive environment, which means that we are definitely respectful of people that might not be aligned with our way of thinking. It's a fine balance. I don't know that anybody has nailed this one, but I'd love to hear from the panelists. How are you guys handling the tension that has certainly arisen over the last 30 to 60 days regarding this election? And do you or your teams have any role in planning for what might happen November 4th or the 90 days following? And I just pose that to anybody. The hot potato. No one wants to talk anymore.
Inclusion doesn't mean harm.
Mm-hmm.
You can believe whatever you want, but you can stop hurting my people. I'm not denying you the ability to participate in democracy. I'm asking you to stop the blatant racism and the hurt. And to me, this is where leaders have to have a point of view. If I was breaking into your house and getting ready to hurt your children, you wouldn't be talking about neutrality. You would not. You'd want to stop that harm. And what this moment is, and this is where people conflate white comfort over Black pain all the time, or some other type of comfort. It could be Black comfort sometimes. The reality is it's time to stop hurting people. It's time to stop the destruction in this nation. And you can have a very different political point of view and not do great destruction in this nation. So for me, I get tired of the political spectrum, quite frankly, because it's useless to the conversation I'm trying to have. Those same folks who are demonstrating the most racist behaviors right now, if you read a book like Dying of Whiteness, their mortality rates are increasing faster than Black men. The design of this nation isn't working for them either. Racism is more of a powerful drug for them than actually accepting that reality. And so one way or another, we're going to come to this reality because this is not sustainable. So what I simply say to people is this: you can believe whatever you want to believe, but that's got to stop where you start doing harm. And as leaders of institutions, that's where we've got to draw the line.
I think, Michael, one of the things you were saying earlier about liberation, I think is where we oftentimes get stuck as a country, right? Because the truth is our country has always been willing to compromise the liberation and freedom, particularly of Black folks, but there's lots of other groups as well, for the sake of political stability and the stability of the country. And you can go all the way back to the institution of slavery. You can go to Reconstruction. You can go to the Compromise of 1877, where we took troops out of the South so we could get a presidential election through. And we've consistently been willing as a country to compromise people's liberation in order to create stability. And that's a huge challenge for companies, because as you try to move towards liberation and build power in communities, it continues to threaten the political equilibrium and stability. And as big companies, we already have targets on our back for lots of different reasons. And absolutely, I'll just be honest, there are people in Washington who have used our leaning into this work as evidence that we are biased against a class of people. And, Carrie, to your point internally, because that's the external environment, right? People are using this as a political football, and there you go again. Internally, you also have we had some employees who wanted us to seriously consider whether the Black Lives Matter movement is a hate speech organization. And so how do you navigate that when you've got some of your own internal employees and all the protected classes and everything saying, I believe that this is a hate speech organization that we're supporting as a company? And the instinct for companies is obviously to run away from all of that. Why would we politically upset the balance in DC when we've got a lot of other, competition, privacy, Section 240, whatever, all these other things that are going on. Why kick the hornet's nest on this? And then internally, it's such a hard knot to untangle. Whose sort of sensitivities and priorities sort of take precedent it is such a hard thing to untangle. And I think the bottom line for me is if you're not willing to be uncomfortable and get down into the messiness, forget about it. You're not built for the work, because it's hard and uncomfortable. And there's been some dark moments as we've kind of walked along this journey where I'm I don't know how to untangle this. This is an impossible knot to untangle. And yet at the end of the day, if my true north is what Michael's saying is liberation for people who've been oppressed, then I know my true north, but the journey to get through it sometimes feels like a dead end. Like, I don't know where else to turn. I'd be curious if Sid, Sarah, Carrie, you all have figured out how to navigate that maze, but it is, politically inside and outside, it's just so challenging sometimes to figure it out.
I would say, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
No, go. You go first.
Well, I would just +1 to everything Justin so eloquently outlined. Couldn't agree more. To answer the question about sort of, do I see any bright lights, or are there any sort of breakthrough? 2 areas that I think are going to be really interesting to watch in the coming year. One, highlighted by your example, is the voice of employees. And as you point out, that can be on either side. But for me, I have seen, I've seen within hours a different kind of conversation about our PAC that is being driven by employees and the transparency there and what that looks like. I've seen a different mobilization for our Black employees to really get involved in these conversations in a leadership way, in an empowered way, that I think is going to lead to a different approach by the company. I also think, though, that there is a national conversation taking place, regardless of who wins this election, about tech. Well, we all know we're living, like, we know that our government affairs and other teams are living that every day. But I think there is reckoning there too, where, policymakers are coming and saying, we need to look at the influence that these companies the power that these companies hold over our democracy, over the way that we communicate and do business and live our lives, and sort of systems. And that how we, in our space, help lead our companies and try to structure a different kind of conversation about who we partner with, what leaders we're working with, what we're supporting, how it fits into the broader sort of impact conversation. I think there is an opportunity there within the next couple of years, and the conversations that's going to be had around this industry to really help shape it. Sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to cut you off before.
No, not at all. I mean, I echo everything that you all have said. I think we're having a lot of conversations about, what is going to happen post November 4th, or Carrie, like you said, 90 days later, because we don't know if we'll know the outcome then. I think part of our work is really making sure that the commitments that we've made and have made previously, even prior to this period, is above the political fray, right? This is not about one party versus another. This is about, Michael, as you said, liberation. This is about Black economic empowerment. This is really just making sure of what is the right thing for this company to be positioned at. And then within that is, how do we create a culture and a workplace where people can have differing opinions? I think what's happening out right now in the public that, is just playing out is people can't seem to have differing opinions right now, right? It's either you're on one side or the other. And if you're on the other side, you're my enemy. And so how do we create a culture where people are always going to have different political inclinations? Right now, it's just a little bit more polarizing given the leaders, but I think it's allowing people to have that honest conversation with each other, with their managers, with their team, because in the conversations that we had since the murder of George Floyd, we've hosted a number of employee town halls and small group conversations, and we always get the question, what about the Latinx population? What about white people? Does this marginalize white people? And we always have to tackle each and every one. And we are actually really grateful that people are asking those questions. It's not just like thoughts in their head that they're having and they're afraid to ask it, but let's have those open and honest conversations so that people can tackle that and discuss it in a professional way without getting to the heated point of where you are not me and I cannot work with you and I cannot have a discussion with you any longer. But we don't have the answers. I think we are taking it day by day to see what the eventual outcomes it will be, but then making sure that we create spaces for employees to have those honest conversations that we similarly did after the 2016 election as well too.
I think along those lines, oh, go ahead, Michael, sorry.
I was just going to say, what you all are describing is really powerful because it is democracy at work. And you're finding ways to do that within your own firm. This is the power of why corporations are at the leading edge. You're struggling with issues in ways that many aspects of society aren't grappling with. You're having the conversations that will make us stronger. That's the muscle that has to be built to be able to hold these conversations and not implode, right? And so I just wanted to signal that, because that is why our democracy is framed right now. We've gotten away from being able to be in this type of relationship where we can have conflict, we can disagree, but we can still hold together. And so that is quite powerful. And that's why I said institutions are so important and corporations are so important in this moment, because imagine the number of employees you all have. That is a critical mass that is transformative if we can replicate that around the country.
Yeah, my comment was just going to be another thing that I think is going to be really interesting to watch, to the point, Sarah, that you had about, and we've seen it in other spaces too. When we launch a program for years ago, girls in STEM, it would immediately be like, what about boys in STEM? What about boys in STEM, right? So we get that too in this space. And I think not even so much that, not even so much the sort of one versus the other. It's the creep that is interesting to me, and what will be appropriate and what not in this space. And so we see already conversations now about the sort of next round of commitments or work that we might do, and should it include indigenous populations and Latinx communities, right? Then we have sort of where does this fit into the international context? And so each of our international regions is doing, and sort of you can see it sort of becoming this broader diversity, equity, inclusion conversation. And we're trying really, we have a commitment around, if some of those additional things happen, because it's, they are not bad conversations to have, and it is not, it is important work to do as well. How do we stay, right? The important conversation for us right now is about Black and African-American communities in the United States, and the history of racism for that community. And so how do we stay focused on that work? How do we keep that as a commitment in and of itself? And how do we, work in other spaces, but keep that as a primary core? And I think that'll just be interesting to watch over the next couple of years in the broader sort of national discourse, and of course the motorcycle riders, but in the broader national discourse, and in sort of as companies, how this work evolves over time.
I would just chime in and say, I think that Justin and Sarah, Justin, you asked, have any of you untangled this knot? No, we have not. And Sarah, when you were saying, it's important that all, viewpoints are respected in the workplace, and that you can have those discussions. We really do run up into the hard wall of employees that, really believe that their colleagues are racist if they're going to vote for this administration, who has canceled D&I training at the federal level, and they can't get past that, right? So there's not a discussion to be had at that point. And to Michael's point of do no harm, stop harming people. I think that that's where the tension that we see with, and I am thrilled that employees have such a voice and feel a sense of trust in leadership, that they can have these conversations, right, visibly public in the town square at work. But I do think that there is some conflict there that's going to come to a head, quite frankly, where it's going to be really hard for companies to remain Switzerland. It's going to be tough. And I think at some point we're going to actually have to get more involved, I would guess, in having an opinion there, rather than saying we respect all opinions. I think that's going to be challenging. And obviously all of us have policies and values that guide decision making and towards that, arc of justice. But I do think it's a very sticky time right now, and it's one that we're really struggling with. And I would just guess that most of us are having these difficult conversations, all the way up to the executive level, with just the political situation that's going on right now at this moment in time.
Yeah, Carrie, I think that's an excellent point. And I'll give one more example of where this has really been challenging and where I've really been leaning in. If you're close to the Black Lives Matter movement, you know that there are a lot of people in the movement who find solidarity with other oppressed people around the world. And one of those groups is Palestinians. And so there are sort of stated policy positions in the Movement for Black Lives platform about the U.S. military divesting from state-sanctioned support of Israel in solidarity with Palestinians. I've been in an ongoing dialogue with Jewish Googlers about that, and we're talking about, like, on all sides of the conversation, it feels life and death. We need to support Black Lives Matter because Black people are being killed and murdered in the United States. At the same time, there's precarious situation in the Middle East too, and people feel like that's life and death. And navigating through those conversations in a corporate context is just like so mind-bending.
It's hard.
Like I've had these conversations like in college, on college campuses, or in nonprofit context, but inside of a company, and some of your instincts for how to navigate through, you realize, to your point, Carrie, like, you're in these tightly bound containers that you have to be really careful to stay within. And I'm like, oh, I realize I can't pull that tool out of the toolbox because that's probably not appropriate in a corporate context. And at some point, if you really push into these justice movements, you're going to get to the point where you hit that edge of, like, I can't go any further without potentially breaking some rules or taking some significant risks. And it is a very hard thing to figure out. And I think maybe Sid or Sarah said this, like, I think leading with humanity certainly is a good starting place, because some of these things, can be solved. I mean, Michael's talking about, and I was really encouraged by this point, like us modeling democracy. If we just tap into each other's humanity, lead with empathy, I've found that I can navigate some of these. But to your point, Carrie, every once in a while, you hit one of these things and you just realize this is life and death for both sides. We can lead with humanity, we can make some progress, but I just can't quite get over the hump because both sides are so invested in the outcome of this. And I don't know, like, how do we create space in a company to hold that? It's a hard thing to figure out.
Yeah, I think thank you for your honesty there as well, because I think that's what we struggle with. I mean, it's challenging, it's thorny, and I don't have the answer. So yeah, we need to stay in contact, all of us, and learn from one another. So I know that we only have a few minutes left, about 5 minutes, and so let's end this on a hopeful note here. What is your hope for 2021, or what is giving you hope for the next year? And I'll just, it's open to everyone. This is a conversation.
I think my hope is that what we've all talked about, I don't think this is a flash in the pan. I don't think this is a one-time only. I think this is a sustained movement that is going to create real change. I think within companies, whatever happens with the election, I don't think that this is going to, I think whoever is present is still going to be, people are still going to hold him accountable for the change that needs to happen. And so that's what makes me hopeful. I think, everybody who works in CSR or in private philanthropy, we're looking at our portfolios, we're doing diversity scans and seeing our organization partners being led by people of color. I think that's going to shift biases that have, or discriminatory practices that have existed in philanthropy. So I think there is even though we're going through a rough patch, it is, and people are finally recognizing what has been systemic and historical racism for quite some time. I do think that there will be real change in the next year and more, because it's going to take a long time.
I'm hopeful. I'm just hopeful because we're here. I mean, this reminds me, frankly, of when gay marriage passed. I thought we were like 30 years away from it, honestly. Like, where the conversation we were having as a company, as a country, that wasn't coming. And yeah, as this movement started, I wasn't sure we would be where we are now, but this is different. I can't believe conversations, really. Like, the conversations that I'm having in our company and inside others is very different. And I couldn't have predicted this 3 years ago because we were so far from this point. So I am hopeful. I think we've outlined a whole bunch of the challenges that all of us that work in this space need to hold and need to then share, so that we're having a conversation about it and understand how we work collectively to keep the momentum going. But the fact that we're even here gives me great hope, because I didn't think we'd be here just a couple of years ago. So I always then, of course, say, like, the youth, because every time I'm talking to people where I think I'm doing something progressive, they're like, you're the man and you're the institution. Here's what you really need to do. So that, it seems sort of a cliche, but I'm telling you, when I'm around young people, they don't have patience for this. They are done. They want change now. That gives me great hope. That gives me great hope.
Michael, anything you would add?
It gives me great hope as well. This next generation isn't going to stand for it, and that's refreshing. But what's also refreshing to me is that I've seen leaders of all walks of life, all races, transform their organizations and be on this journey in ways that I would have never thought. I can tell you so many stories of leaders who are taking up the cause of stamping out anti-Black racism in this nation, and they don't look like me. That's been a long time coming, but it's real. That's real. And it started with their own journeys, and then it started with them going into their organizations and doing work. And now it's with them championing this cause wholeheartedly. I never thought I would see that at this level. And so that's what I'm hopeful for. And lastly, I'm hopeful that, we recently did an equity survey of racial attitudes in America. And people are signaling that race has to be dealt with now. That's huge. There's still some blind spots around seeing the structural stuff. But we're seeing more and more that as this nation becomes a nation of color, that if we do not deal with this problem, this wicked problem of the Black-white paradigm in this nation will not be strong. And that gives me hope, because if the nation's not strong, we're not going to have stable markets. And that's just going to be the reality. So I'm hopeful that the convergence of all this collective pain is going to help us make some big steps forward.
Great, thank you. Justin, anything that you would want to add?
Just +1, I think young people leading the movement. And then as Scott Robinson likes to say, moving from presence to power. I'm just really encouraged.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for your honesty and transparency in this conversation. I feel energized just hearing about all of the movement making you are involved with. And I just thank you so much for your time and appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Steve and Dwayne to close us out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.